our Mantova Architettura lecture dedicated to aesthetic philosophy. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Elisa Caldarola, who is going to talk to us about the conception of site-specific architecture. This is a subject in which we should all be deeply interested, because for architecture, the relationship with the site is something crucial. And today we have the chance to talk about it not just from a practical point of view, but also from a theoretical perspective. Our speaker has spent her recent research studying the idea of site-specific in the art domain and is currently an honorary fellow at the University of Padova. She has previously been a research fellow at the same university and also a Fulbright scholar at the University of Maryland and a visiting scholar at the University of Santiago de Compostela. She has published articles and contributed papers on depiction, caricature, participatory art, and meta-ontology of art. Well, without further ado, I give the word to Elisa Caldarola. Welcome, Elisa.
Thanks, Fabrizia, for having me here, and thank you all for being wherever you are now, but connected to the internet. And so, just a few words about how I think to structure this lecture or seminar, if you want, today. I am going to talk for, I think, no more than 45 minutes, perhaps less, and there will be some time left for questions from you, if you have questions. But if I say something that doesn't sound understandable, both in terms of content or in terms of my English, please feel free to interrupt me. I think the best way you can do that is just to type your question on the sidebar. So the other thing I wanted to say is that your professor, Fabrizia Bandi, she sent you a sort of handout, a document that I prepared a few days ago, which should serve as a guide to the structure of today's lecture. And so it might help you to look at it from time to time, because it is a means for you to anticipating the topics that I will discuss. And so it might help you thinking about examples or questions that you want to ask me, because it gives you the general structure of my talk. Okay. I think this is all, and so I shall start with, well, first, a very, very brief introduction about myself. The only thing I want to say is that, well, I am a philosopher, and so part of my job as a philosopher is try to give more accurate definitions of categories. Why do we need more accurate definitions of categories that we apply to objects in the world? Well, because it helps us understand how to use such categories better, right? And that of site-specific architecture is a category that, well, the literature has started to apply to buildings since, I would say, probably the early 90s. And it's not clear, there is no consensus about what constitutes a site-specific building. So it's an interesting question for a philosopher to try and understand what are the limits of this concept and what exactly we are trying to say when we say that a building, for instance, is site-specific. So this is the kind of work that I would like to do, and I have just started to do with respect to architecture. So this lecture is an introduction to some topics of research that are quite recent also for me. What is less recent recent as a research topic to me is site-specific art. I have been working on site-specific art for a while, and the interesting thing in the context of this lecture is that the term site-specific emerged not in architectural contexts, but in the art literature. Art literature from the 1960s on, basically. And it has been initially used to describe only certain works produced since the second half of the 20th century. So it is a recent category, and it was born to describe some kinds of contemporary art. And towards the end of my lecture, I will say something more about this. But keep this in mind. So this category has this origin, and then it has also entered the architectural jargon. And this is an issue that we will look a little bit deeper into later. Okay, so what do I mean when I talk about architecture here today? So I'm not going to talk about all sorts of architectural products. So first of all, I am only going to talk about projects that have been realized. I'm not going to talk about mere projects. This merely for the sake of simplicity and also for a very obvious thing. Since when you want to talk about site-specific architecture, you want to talk about architecture that has some particular relationship with a site. Well, it's better if you stick to architecture that already exists in a site. You know, it helps you make examples that are more specific, more fine-grained. And the other thing I'm not going to talk about is what we could call landscape architecture. And the reason why I will be, I think, mostly largely avoiding landscape architecture is that it is an extremely interesting topic in the context of site-specific architecture, but it is a peculiar one, which would require talking about also its relationship with certain other practices, like the practice of gardening and the practice of producing works of land art, or that of producing works of environmental art, all art currents that have emerged in the second half of the 20th century. So that would require a much more sophisticated discussion of the intersection between certain architectural practices and certain art practices. And that's sort of a next level kind of discussion. What I want to focus about are mostly buildings that have been built. And another reason why I want to focus on buildings is that what I believe is quite interesting is that, as it shall emerge from my discussion, also buildings that apparently might not seem to have a very strong relationship with a landscape might actually have some relevant relationship with the site, and might even qualify as site-specific to a certain extent. So what is obvious for landscape architecture is perhaps less obvious for other kinds of buildings, and those are interesting cases to discuss because they are more mysterious, so to speak. Last premise, I'm also not going to talk about the work of some architects who have been super relevant for the development of site-specific art. For instance, Gordon Matta Clark, who, with his cuts on buildings, is often described as an artist who produced site-specific art by subtracting matter from architectural buildings rather than building buildings. And another artist who has produced a very, very famous monument that is usually described as a site-specific art is Maya Lin, who is the architect of the designer of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. And again, that is a work that is a memorial, as I have already said, and that does not qualify as a building, is not a structure that is meant to be inhabited. And so perhaps it should be more appropriate to talk about it as a work of site-specific art, even though it was designed by an architect. So this is what I'm not going to talk about. Now let's go to the topic of the talk. So how do I intend to seek an answer to the question, what is site-specific architecture? Well, I will use a methodology that is not particularly new. It is about 1700 years old, and it is inspired by what philosophers call the Porphyrian tree. So what is the Porphyrian tree? Very simple. Porphyry is a philosopher from the 3rd century after Christ. And he developed a methodology to present Aristotle's classification of categories. So roughly the idea is you start from the most general concept, which we could call a genre, and then you distinguish between more and more specific species within the genre. So, in other words, you start from a macro category and then you distinguish between more specific subcategories and even more specific subcategories and even more specific subcategories and so on. So the terminology I'm using is not historically accurate, but this is not relevant for our topic. What is relevant is that you get the sort of structure of thought that I am following. So basically what I'm going to propose is a taxonomy of relationships between buildings and sites. And this taxonomy is not going to be complete. This is a work in progress. And if you happen to have suggestions about examples that you think I should consider, and of course also if you have objections to what I'm saying, I will be super happy to hear your thoughts. Okay, so let's begin with the macro category, which is the category of buildings. Okay, we can draw a first distinction. We could say, well, there are buildings in a certain sense that are not physically located. And then one could say, well, which buildings are those? Well, I mentioned them at the very beginning. Those are buildings that have merely been planned. So projects for buildings, actually. So I won't bother you with the philosophical thought underlying this claim, but it is sufficient for you to know that there is a way to claim that even a building that has been merely planned and not realized is a building, okay? But that definitely is a building that has no physical location, okay? It does not have a certain latitude or a certain longitude, okay? So here we are only interested in physically located buildings. And now comes an obvious question. Of all the buildings that have been built, Which ones are physically located? Well, the obvious answer is, of course, every single building that has ever been built, okay? They all have existed at a certain latitude and longitude. And they also are relative to time, because not all buildings, well, first of all, they come into existence at a certain point, and second, they can also end at some point. They can be destroyed. Okay, but the time issue is an issue that we will set apart for today. So all buildings, they are physically located. And this is perhaps the most generic relationship that a building which exists in the world can have to a physical site. And this is clearly a relationship that plenty of things, plenty of stuff enjoys with a physical site. So I am physically located in my apartment right now. You are physically located in your apartments, and the tree out of my window is physically located somewhere, again, at a certain latitude and longitude. Okay, so now let's look a bit deeper into physically located buildings. And here, we could try and draw a further distinction. A distinction between buildings that, this is a terminology that I suggest to use, buildings that are sited and buildings that are not sited. So sited buildings and non-sited buildings. So what do I mean by sited buildings? Well, to explain this, I will derive from some arguments that have been put forward by a colleague of mine, Fabio Bacchini, in a paper that you can find on the internet, which is called The Persistence of Buildings and the Context Problem. And it has appeared in a journal called Footprint in 2017. Well, Bacchini begins by considering this scenario. So Bacchini suggests that we think about a particular building, like for instance, the Church of Notre Dame in Padova. Any building should do. According to Bacchini, and I agree with him, we have this intuition. So if we think of an imaginary scenario, an imaginary world in which we are capable of transferring the whole of Notre Dame Cathedral from Paris to, for instance, Las Vegas, stone by stone. So we take each of the stones that are in Paris now and we bring them to Las Vegas. So where was I? Think about transferring Notre Dame from Paris to Las Vegas, stone by stone. So you take exactly the same stones and you bring them to Las Vegas. You do not copy Notre Dame, you bring it to Las Vegas, okay? So one could say, well, the building has been transferred, right, to Las Vegas. It has not merely been copied in the city of Las Vegas. But we have the feeling that the building, the Church of Notre Dame, is not the same anymore when instead of in Paris, we find it in Las Vegas. Do you share this intuition that if you were to encounter a building that you know is the original Notre Dame building, but you find it in the middle of the strip in Las Vegas, you would have the feeling that that is not really Notre Dame anymore, that something has changed that was essential to the identity of the building of the Church of Notre Dame. So Bacchini suggests that we depart from this intuition, that this is crucial about the way we think about buildings, not just about Notre Dame, which is merely an example. In any case, this slide was very basic, so you can picture Notre Dame thanks to this slide now. So where were we? We were in Las Vegas, where the original Notre Dame church has been transferred stone by stone. And the thought is, this is not the Church of Notre Dame anymore, even if the stones are the original ones and they are all put together as they were put together in the original church. So Bacchini asked a further question. So what has happened? Why do we have this intuition that the church is not the same anymore? Consider that we don't have the same kind of intuition about all sorts of objects. Like if now I move from the living room of my apartment to my bedroom, I have the feeling that I have stayed the same. I am still the same person. And if we could travel and I could travel to Paris this afternoon, well, once landed in Paris, well, I would have the feeling that I would be the very same person, the very same Elisa Caldarola that is now in Padova would be moved to Paris. And the same would go for my pairs of shoes, for my suitcase, and so forth and so on. So these intuitions about stuff that is transferred from a place into another and that loses part of its identity is an intuition that we don't have about all sorts of things. So architecture seems peculiar in this way. So the short answer, why does this happen with architecture, is, well, because the fact of being located in a certain space is constitutive, as philosophers say, of architecture. Constitutive simply means it is essential to their identity. Well, let's try and understand a bit more how this being constitutive works. So, other imaginary scenario. Imagine that not just the Church of Notre Dame, but the whole city of Paris is relocated to Nevada in the US. Okay? And now we can ask the question, what about the Church of Notre Dame? Do we have the feeling that it is still the same church once the whole city of Paris has been transferred to the state of Nevada? And, imagine you are in the middle of the city of Paris, in Nevada, and you look at the Church of Notre Dame and you enter the church, whatever you want. Well, it seems that we wouldn't feel a difference between this situation and the situation that would occur when we are in Paris, France, and we experience Notre Dame. Okay? So, if you agree with this claim that once you bring the whole city of Paris to Nevada, Notre Dame remains the same, stays the same. If you agree with this view, well, this view shows you an important thing, that what matters to keep the identity of a building like Notre Dame is not that the building keeps its original physical location, its original latitude and longitude, but it is that it remains in the same material context. What is fundamental for Notre Dame to be Notre Dame is that it remains located in Paris with the kind of buildings and other urban elements that the fact of being located in Paris brings with it, okay? The context has to stay the same. So if you move the whole context of the city to Nevada, the context stays the same, and you have the impression that Notre Dame has not changed. Now think about a yet alternative scenario. Yet one more alternative scenario. So we are in Paris. Notre Dame stays the same, so it does not change location, but the rest of the city is substituted by the city of Las Vegas. Again, it seems that in this case, this feeling of, oh, Notre Dame is not the same anymore, would resurface. You would have this feeling again. And this is a further proof of the fact that what matters for the identity of the building is that one of the things that matter for the identity of the building is that the context stays the same. So if Paris is turned into Las Vegas, it cannot work. Now, one more thing about this Notre Dame case. We all know that the city of Paris has changed a lot since when the Church of Notre Dame was built in the 13th century, okay? But it seems that this fact does not seem to bother us very much. We wouldn't go around claiming, well, the Notre Dame cannot be experienced properly. It is not the kind of building that it used to be because the city around it has changed in the meanwhile. And this is puzzling, right? So we want the context to stay. So we want Paris to remain Paris around Notre Dame. But at the same time, we are okay if Paris changes a little, or even quite a lot, okay? Well, the idea underlying this intuition, very roughly speaking, is the following, that to change a context is not merely to change some properties of a context. So to change a city is not merely to change some properties of the city. So the city is like an organism that evolves during time, keeping its identity. Just like I and all of you evolve during time, we keep aging and we change, but we still stay the same in terms of being the same individuals. I am not a different person from the one I was when I was born. I am still Elisa Caldarola, and Paris is still Paris. Okay, so this was the most philosophically loaded part of the presentation. I put it at the beginning because I'm kind. And now let's try to develop on this to investigate further this notion of site specificity. So, as I said, this part, the part that I have just gone through, I have borrowed from Fabio Bacchini's analysis. But now there comes a point where his analysis and mine diverge. So he claims that what he shows about the relationship between Notre Dame and its context, its material context, well, not only applies to all buildings, which is something I agree on, but it also shows that all buildings are site-specific. Whereas here I would say, well, wait a sec. I think that when we talk about site specificity, we talk about something more fine-grained. So in what follows, I will show why I believe that being site-specific is more than merely being cited to a context. And so I believe that not all buildings are site-specific, although all buildings are cited to a context, just like Notre Dame is. And one last thing I want to say about buildings cited to a context. So if we talk about the case of the Church of Notre Dame and the city of Paris, we have a building that has as a context a very, very specific environment. With lots of remarkable buildings, with a very long history of development. But of course, not all buildings are like that. So consider, for instance, this barn, okay? It is in the middle of a rather generic countryside. And I think we can imagine that, you know, if we had the means, of course, those are all imaginary examples, we could move that very barn to a similar countryside landscape. We could even, you know, reconstruct that landscape in order to reproduce a context in which the barn appears exactly as it used to appear in its original context. So it seems that certain sites, like the city of Paris, are very, very particular, very peculiar, whereas other sites, they are more generic, like the generic countryside that is the context for this generic barn. And so perhaps a way to refine the view that the context is an essential aspect of a building, a way to refine this claim is to say that there is context and context, so to speak. So some contexts are very particular and other contexts are generic. So if a building is cited to generic context, we might think that relocating it to a context of the very same kind would be no harm. We would have the same experience when encountering the building in a generic context of the same kind of the original context of the building. Okay. The same is not true of, for instance, this barn. Okay, so not all natural landscapes, of course, are generic. So, for instance, this one is a barn in the Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming, and the mountains you see in the background are the Teton Range. And the Teton Range is pretty unique, okay? So you cannot think of relocating that barn to a different material context and having an experience equivalent to the one you have in its original context. So in the first part, we have established, hopefully, that all buildings that exist are essentially tied to their material context, which perhaps can be either particular or generic. Okay? And now what I want to suggest is that the relationship of site specificity that a building can enjoy with its context is something more than that. And in particular, it has got something to do with the fact that the material context, the site, has been taken into consideration when the building has been produced. So the architects who have designed the building and those who have played a role into realizing the building, bringing it into existence, they had certain intentions about the site. And those intentions have been realized in the building. So it's not merely that they thought, oh, it would be nice that if this building had a certain relationship with the site, but it's that they have managed to establish that relationship with the site by producing the building. Okay? So now the question is, well, but what kind of relationships with the site are we talking about? And what I suggest to do now is to look into different kinds of relationships that can be established between buildings and sites. And what is crucial, though, is that we keep in mind that in the background there is this idea that all buildings are sited, meaning that their material context is part of their identity, and so they lose their identity. They are not anymore the buildings that they used to be if their site changes. Okay, so a distinction that now I want to introduce is between buildings that are sited but are not site responsive, and buildings that are sited and are also site responsive. So what do I mean by being site responsive? Well, it will emerge more clearly with the examples, but to begin with, the general idea is that when a building is site responsive, it adapts to specific configurations of its site. Okay? And this is not something all buildings do. There are some buildings that are quite indifferent to their site. And I want to stress that they are indifferent, not antagonizing. So as we shall see, being antagonistic with respect to a site, as with respect to anything else, implies taking the thing that you want to antagonize into consideration, because you kind of want to criticize it by antagonizing it. And this is different from simply not caring at all about something, not taking into consideration. So what I'm claiming is that there are buildings, probably, that do not take their site into consideration. And I want to call them non-site responsive buildings. So let's look at the presentation. And here we have an example, I believe. This is Warsaw's Palace of Culture and Science, which was built by, which was designed by Lev Rudnev and built between 1952 and 1955 in the very city center of Warsaw. And it's quite a masterful late Art Deco building. It is a very contexted building because when it was built, Warsaw had just been almost entirely destroyed by the Soviets, who also financed the construction of this building, and who did not take at all into consideration the kind of architectural landscape that characterized Warsaw before it was destroyed during the war, before it was destroyed during Second World War. And roughly we could say that this building was built where previously mostly neoclassical architecture would stand. And so the building does not take into consideration what Warsaw used to be before being largely destroyed during the war. And what it takes into consideration are other buildings in the former Soviet Union, which are actually quite similar to it. Okay, so this is a case of a building that is not site responsive. And I want to stress that not being site responsive is not necessarily a mark of being a bad building. So, for instance, it's very controversial because the circumstances of its creation are definitely morally bad, but it's quite easy to agree that it is quite a beautiful building. And in fact, over time, it has become a symbol of the city of Warsaw. And as you can easily see from this picture, the more recent high-rise buildings and skyscrapers that have been built, well, they have taken it into consideration. They have been site responsive. And so they have tried to adapt to this new skyline of Warsaw that was, so to speak, inaugurated with this Soviet building from the 1950s. Okay, so not necessarily not being site responsive equals being bad in all sorts of respect. I do not want to suggest this claim. Okay, so now let's look at examples of buildings that are site responsive. In the meanwhile, if in the back of your mind you want to think of other examples of non-site responsive buildings, please do that. And you can either write your examples down or you can describe them later in the question and answers question, okay? So, site responsive buildings. One way of being site responsive is what I would call blending in the site. And probably the most famous example of architecture that blends in its site are, well, numerous works by Frank Lloyd Wright, who famously claimed, "No house should ever be it should be of the hill, belonging to it. Hill and house should live together, each the happier for the other." So let's see the super famous example, which is Falling Water, built in 1935 near Pittsburgh in Indiana. So here we have a house whose color is the same shade as the undersides of the leaves of the trees that surround the building, which famously has those horizontal lines that are meant to integrate it within the rocky landscape around the creek, and which even more famously has been built right above the waterfall in such a way that it looks as if the waterfall originates from the house itself, right? It also has very big windows, which allow for the greenery that surrounds the building to be perceived also when one is inside the house. So it adopts all those devices to blend in the environment. So it is there, but from a distance, you have to really focus in order to be able to perceive it, because it is sort of mimetized within the natural environment. Again, I suggest you think of similar example of architecture that blends in its site, and we can discuss them later if you want. Okay, let's look at a different way in which a building can respond to its site. So we have seen the blending in kind of response, and now we are going to see a very different kind of response, which I will call the site antagonizing response. So this is again a rather famous building, the Bosco Verticale by Boeri Studio, which was built between 2007 and 2014 in Milan. Well, it encompasses around 800 trees and roughly the equivalent of a small wood. And thanks to this, across the years, it has provided a habitat for around 1,600 birds and butterflies. So what was the idea, one of the ideas that motivated the construction of this building? Well, the idea was we are in the center of Milan, and the center of Milan lacks in nature, in trees. And what the architects wanted to do was to bring nature back into the city. So the building, as I claim, is a site antagonizing because it acknowledges that something is missing from the site, and it constitutes a challenge to it. It's like it is saying, okay, you don't have green, traditional green spaces. Well, let's bring the green spaces in a different way. Let's build a tower that hosts 400 trees. Okay? Again, I invite you to think of alternative examples of site antagonizing buildings. A third way of responding to a site that I would like to illustrate is that of buildings that adapt to a certain site. And the example I have chosen is Matera's Sassi architecture. So the Sassi in Matera, a city in southern Italy, in Basilicata, the Sassi began to be inhabited 9,000 years ago, roughly, and they were natural caves. And then, over the course of time, well, human presence remained a constant in the city of Matera, and so people started building more refined buildings that incorporated the caves, because that is the only way you could build something in that kind of site, especially with the technical limitations of times past. So those buildings that incorporate caves are buildings that have responded to the site by means of adapting to its physical configuration, okay? Sometimes the adaptation has produced rather interesting buildings in themselves. For instance, Matera is well known for some relevant Baroque architecture. So adaptation doesn't mean that you cannot develop a building that is interesting of its own, but it means that you choose to fund to the site by means of trying to find room within it, so to speak, without destroying it. Again, I suggest you think of alternative examples of site adaptation for our Q&A. And this is all I have to say about site-responsive buildings in general. And we have seen 3 ways of responding to the site: blending in the site, antagonizing the site, adapting to it. And there might be other ways, probably many other ways of responding to a site. So the ones I have given to you are just examples, which should help you, I hope, begin to think in this direction of identifying specific relationship that a building might have to its site. Now, I want to introduce a further distinction concerning site-responsive buildings. So, on the one hand, we have site-responsive buildings that are not about their sites. And on the other hand, we have site-responsive buildings that are instead about their sites. So what do I mean by a building being about its own site? Well, basically, I mean this. A building that is about its own site is a building that responds to the site, and it also seeks to draw attention to some feature of the site in virtue of how it has been built. So it is built in such a way that one of the effects it has on the people who experience it is that those people's attention is drawn towards the site. So you experience the building, and if the building is a site-responsive building that is also about its site, the building manages to channel your attention to some aspect, towards some aspect of the site. If you build a site-responsive building that is not about its site, well, you don't do this. You do not build a building that challenges the public's attention towards some aspect of its site. So let's consider, first of all, an example of a building that is not about its site, even if it is site responsive, as I have already claimed. So, for instance, I believe that we could say that Bosco Verticale is not about its site, because it is not a building that actively seeks to draw attention to the fact that the city center of Milan is lacking in trees. What it does is quite the opposite. So it is a building, 2 buildings again. They are buildings that bring trees to the city. Okay, so the attention is drawn to the fact that there are buildings on this, that there are trees on the surface of those buildings, when you look at them, that is what is salient, what you notice. It's not like you are invited to think about the fact that otherwise Milan would lack in trees. Yes, this is something you can do, but I think it would be not appropriate to claim that the buildings were built in order to have this kind of effect on the viewer. Rather, they were built in order to make the public, happy of the fact that at least now there are some trees in Milan's city center. And probably similar considerations could be made about Matera's Sassi. So whoever built those buildings upon the caves doesn't seem to have designed them in order to draw attention on the fact that there are caves there. Caves are merely an aspect of the site that whoever built the buildings had to accommodate, had to react to. But those are not buildings that are meant to make salient the presence of caves in the site. Now, again, I invite you to think of alternative examples of buildings that are site responsive but are not about their sites. And now let's look at buildings that are instead about their sites. And a third thing I wanted to stress is that there's plenty of buildings that are about some sites, which are sites different from the ones where they are located, where they are sited. So, for instance, IMP's Louvre Pyramids are obviously about a very well-known site, that is the Giza pyramids in Cairo, that are the pyramids that everyone knows, okay? So we could say that perhaps that they quote those pyramids, but the thing is that the Louvre pyramids are in Paris, okay? They are not in Cairo, and therefore they are not about their own site. Otherwise, they would have to be about Paris. So, plenty of buildings can be about sites, but only some buildings that are about sites are about their own site. Let's look at an example. So this is Peter Eisenman's City of Culture of Galicia, which opened in 2011 in Santiago de Compostela in Spain. And the way it draws attention to some feature of its site, so the way it is about its site, I would claim, is the site representing, and more specifically, the site imitating way. So the whole structure of this cultural center imitates the shape of the hills that surround the city of Santiago. And the effect that is reached through this technique is not simply that of blending in the landscape of the city of Santiago, surrounding the city of Santiago, like in the case of Wright's Falling Water house. But the effect is one that enhances our appreciation of the landscape of the city of Santiago. Okay, so you see that, well, you see the city center in the foreground of this picture, and then to the left you see the city of culture, and then in the background you see other hills in the area. And I would claim that one of the effects that this building has on the viewer that looks at it from far away is that it makes us more aware of the beautiful shapes that the hilly landscape around Santiago takes. Okay, so it draws our attention to some feature of the site by means of representing it, by means of imitating its shape. And in the same architectural complex, there are, so the same complex includes two towers that you can see to the right of the main buildings, also in this photograph, and here you can see one of them better. So those towers, they are a project of John Hyder, and the project was not realized, but then it was recovered by Peter Eisenman, and it was installed in the broader site of his city of culture. And what these towers do is that they imitate, although in a very schematic way, the shape of the facade of Santiago's cathedral, which again you can see in this picture. And so again, here we have an element that represents, by means of imitation, an aspect of the site in such a way that it draws attention to it. So if you're looking at this building from a distance and you pay some attention, you will notice that there is this sort of mirroring of the contemporary towers towards the two towers that are so distinctive of the facade of the church. Okay, so this is a kind of architectural complex that responds to its site in that it takes it into consideration, and it also highlights aspects of the site. So it is also about its site. Now, let's look at a different example, a different way in which a site-responsive building can also be about its site. And here the example I have selected is a very famous, very different kind of building, which is Giuseppe Sacconi's Vittoriano, which was built between 1885 and 1935 in Rome, and is also known as the monument to Vittorio Emanuele II, or the altar, Altare della Patria. Whoa, I forgot how. Altar of the Nation, and also as the wedding cake. So this building was conceived as a modern forum in Rome. And my claim is that it quotes the ancient foro in Rome, the ancient foro romano from Roman times. So it does not just resemble the foro romano with the purpose of imitation in order to highlight it, as we have seen in the city of culture in Santiago case, but it takes the Foro Romano as its historical and cultural antecedent, and it quotes it as one would quote an established scholar in a book to support one thesis, for instance. So we could say that this building quotes Roman times in order to celebrate the time, contemporary time, the time that was contemporary to those who designed it. Again, try and think of other buildings that behave similarly, that quote an aspect of the site where they are, where they find themselves. Further example of a building that is site responsive but is also about its site. So this is under an underwater restaurant that opened last year in 2019 in Norway by the architectural enterprise Snøhettas. I don't know whether I have pronounced it correctly. So, like the like Wright's Falling Water, it is a building that blends with its site. It blends in its site. Sorry, and we could also say that it is a building that imitates it, because it imitates the rock formations that the small fjord in which it is located is comprised of. So it blends in the site, it imitates it, but it also does something else, I believe. That is, it highlights its site. Why does it highlight the site? Why does it make an aspect of the site that was previously not evident? Why does it make an aspect of the site that was previously not evident emerge, highlighting it, underlining it? Well, because it is partially submerged in the water of the fjord, and it has windows, especially this big one, that look into the depths of the sea, we could say, provide a view of the seabed and the life around it. So the building manages to make accessible an aspect of its site, that is the fjord, that would not be that its visitors would not otherwise be able to experience, or at least they would not be able to experience so easily, because they would have to go underwater in a more dangerous way. So this is what I mean by highlighting one's site, making some aspect of the site that would be difficult to notice noticeable. And again, I invite you to think of alternative examples of site highlighting buildings. And I've got two more examples that I would like to present before I finish. And the next one is the Palestinian Museum in Birzeit by the architectural firm Hannigan Panks, that opened in 2016. And what I want to claim is that this is a site-responsive building that is also about its site because it brings its site to the foreground. So it makes certain aspects of its site more evident. And unlike the site highlighting building, it is, so to speak, deferential towards its site. It like the building that blends in the site, it sort of seeks to disappear inside its site. But by means of disappearing inside the site, it makes it more relevant, more visible because of some of its aspects. So let's see how this works. So the museum has been built around pre-existing agricultural terraces that were built by local villagers to adapt the terrain for cultivation. And by incorporating those terraces and not emerging a lot from the surface from the ground, it manages to draw attention to them. Also, what is relevant is that this is a very specific kind of land where terraces were built, because, as we all know, it is a land that is resisting the military occupation of the West Bank. So, by means of blending in the terraced site and making it such a relevant part of its structure, this museum highlights the presence of the agricultural terraces as a ground that is still in the hands of the Palestinian population. So it does not just blend in the site, it does not just highlight an aspect of the site, like the underwater restaurant, but it brings the site to the foreground, while the architecture remains in the background, so to speak. So what you are supposed to notice first and foremost is the terraces, is the fact that this building occupies a very contested site. Okay, no matter what you think about that. What I'm trying to describe is just the kind of conceptual operation that is in place here. So the site is what really matters when we look at this building. It matters a lot more than the building of the museum itself. A further example that I would like to consider, and it is the last architectural example that I will take into consideration, is Berlin's Neues Museum. And I know that you have already talked about this specific building with Professor Bandi. So I will be very short. So the original site of the Neues Museum is a building designed by Friedrich Stüler and built between 1843 and 1859. So it's a neoclassical building which celebrated the greatness of the Prussian kingdom and suggested its having inherited the greatness of both the classical Greco-Roman past, whose architecture it quoted abundantly, and also it stresses the fact that the Prussian kingdom had inherited the greatness of its German past, and this was more evident from some of the inside decorative works, especially in the rooms where there were paintings of very well-known German landscapes and also ancient Nordic deities. Okay. So what happens? Well, this building is partially destroyed during Second World War, and unlike other museum buildings in Berlin's Museum Insel, it is not restored. It remains a ruin for quite a long time. Until the early 2000s, when the work on the restoration finally begins. And the work is the fruit of a project made by David Chipperfield, David Chipperfield's architectural firm, and Julian Harrop's architectural firm. And the museum reopened finally in 2009. So, sorry, one important thing I haven't said before is that since when it first opened in the 19th century, this building has hosted largely an archaeological museum with collections encompassing Egyptian art, Greek art, Roman art, but also Paleolithic artifacts that were found in the territory that was the Prussian territory at the time of the construction of the museum. And today, the kind of collection it hosts has remained largely similar, to cut a long story short. Now, what is relevant about the project of restoration of the Neues Museum is that Chipperfield and Harrop didn't want to stress the ruin aspect of this building. You have to think that this building remained a ruin for many decades, and so it kind of became a landmark of the center of Berlin in its state of ruin. It was a sort of monument to the destruction that World War II caused in the city, okay? So one of the things the architects didn't want to do was to stress this identity as a ruin. But also, what they didn't want to do was the opposite, to rebuild the building exactly as it used to be, okay, in the 19th century. And what they were asked to do by a committee that had been appointed by the city of Berlin and other German institutions, was to find a way in which the new and the old could interact, so that the new would show respect. The new building would show respect for the older building. And Chipperfield has declared that his motto for this project was, "The new reflects the lost without imitating it." And so what they did was, well, on the one hand, painstakingly restoring to their original place all the parts of the building that could be restored. And this goes from the smaller details that you can identify, for instance, by looking at this picture of the facade, to more substantial parts of the building, like, for instance, the very famous staircase. So, as you can see, the staircase had to be rebuilt, but the environment around it that could be preserved has been preserved stone by stone. And another thing that they did is that they restored the ancient building, but they did not restore it in such a way that that made it look almost new. Okay, so this way the distinction between the older parts and the newer parts is always evident, because the older parts, so to speak, keep looking old, right? Okay, so so one last example, they also, when possible, sought to maintain the original, to keep the original decorations of the buildings, as we can see from this image, where we see that some of the mural paintings illustrating idealized scenes from Roman times, well, they have been partially preserved, as we can see. So why am I describing this building in the context of buildings that are site responsive and in particular are about their site? Well, my claim is that the architectural intervention made by Chipperfield and Harrap on the former building by Friedrich Stüler, well, was clearly site responsive, because it did take into consideration the previous building by Stüler, as any restoration does, right? But more specifically, it was site respectful, because it sought to so to speak, bring new life to the older building, not by means of reconstructing it, not by means of presenting it as a ruin, because a ruin is not something that is alive, is the remains of something that was alive, that used to be alive. But instead, it tried to revitalize, so to speak, the older building by making architectural interventions that were extremely respectful of it. And in order to respect it, the interventions did not mock it. They clearly displayed their character of newer modern, contemporary interventions, as it can be seen at its best in the case of the Great Staircase, which I don't have the picture here, but it replaces a very ornate 19th century staircase. Okay? So, last 5 minutes, if that is okay, to draw a sort of conclusion. So the question today was, what do we talk about when we talk about site-specific architecture? And I have tried to describe a way in which we can answer this question by means of distinguishing between more and more specific ways in which architects can take into consideration the sites where buildings are sited. And now it is time to go back to what I said at the very beginning of the talk. So I said that site-specific is a term, is a category that was first employed to describe certain forms of contemporary visual arts. And only later the term entered architectural language. And here, of course, we don't have the time to trace the story and to describe different kinds of site-specific art. But there is one point that I would like you to take home. So, site-specific art is art that has a site as its reason of existence. It is not merely art for which its material context is relevant, okay? So, all public art, almost all public art, from any time, has a relationship with its material context, because it is important that it is outside, it is in public, in order to, it is important to understand that it is meant to be outside, that it is meant to be placed in a public space in order to experience it properly, okay? It's important when you see a statue of Garibaldi in the middle of a square that you understand that that statue was placed there in order to celebrate an Italian hero of the nation from the 19th century in a public space. That statue would not have the same effect within a private courtyard. So, plenty of artworks take into consideration their site in some way. But when contemporary art critics talk about site-specific art, they talk about artworks that are peculiar in that they take the site as their reason of existence. So what do I mean by this? Now I will illustrate just one example, and then I will go back to architecture and suggest an hypothesis about site-specific architecture. So the example, I don't have a picture of it because it is not relevant to have a picture. So the example is a work of sound installation by the artist Andrea Fraser, and it is called Down the River, and it was installed in 2016 inside the building of the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. And the new building of the Whitney Museum that has been designed by Renzo Piano's architectural practice. And that has it has many peculiarities. One of them is this. So it is a building that on one side faces the Hudson River. So it provides a beautiful view of the river of New Jersey on the other side of the Hudson River. And it's got huge windows from which you can enjoy the views. And it is also the biggest exhibition space non-interrupted by walls or columns in New York, which means that on one of its floors, you can, if you want, install a huge exhibition without having to deal with the issue of installing artworks around specific architectural elements. So, a huge room that on one side overlooks the Hudson River. What Andrea Fraser did with her work down the river was this. She took the whole room for the work and installed her sound installation. So if you entered the room, you didn't see anything. It was entirely empty. But you could hear some sounds. And those sounds had been previously recorded in the Sing Sing prison by the artist. So they were environmental sound recorded within the prison. And what is interesting is that the prison is sited not far away from New York City, and the building of the prison also overlooks the Hudson River. So it does not face the Whitney Museum of American Art, because of course the museum is in New York, whereas the prison is outside of New York. But both buildings overlook the very same river. But of course, the kind of institutions that the buildings host are very different. So the Whitney Museum is a museum, so it's a place that is open to visitors. And as many museums, especially contemporary art museums, it tends to attract a quite affluent and a quite white public. Consider that we are in the US. Whereas the Sing Sing prison, on the other hand, is definitely not a building that is open to the public. It is definitely not a building that provides views of the Hudson River, unlike the museum building, and it is a building that hosts largely a poor, impoverished, and black population. Okay, so those two buildings sort of symbolize the two poles of contemporary American society. And what the artist did was to bring the sound of one building, of the prison, inside the other building. Okay? So this is a work that is site-specific in that it is both about the museum that hosts it and about the prison whose sound it makes available to the public. Okay? It is an artwork that establishes a relationship between these two different buildings in order to make a claim about the polarization of contemporary American society, right? So when I say that the work has its site as its reason of existence, this is what I want to claim, that the work does not just respond to this site, does not just make a point about the site, and does not just say something about the site, that is, that one is the symbol of oppression and the other is the symbol of affluence of the 1%, of the fact that only a very tiny fraction of the American population can enjoy a certain lifestyle, okay? It does not just make a point about that, but the fact of making a point about that aspect of its site, its very reason of existence. It is its most distinctive character. And now I get to the conclusion, going back to architecture. So my proposal is this, that site-specific architecture, truly site-specific architecture, is architecture that has its site as its reason for existence. And I think that this is evident in buildings like the site for grounding Palestinian Museum we have seen before, and like the site-respectful Neues Museum. I'm not sure that we have reasons to make the same claims about other site-responsive buildings that are also about their sites. And this is all I have to say. I thank you for your attention and your patience. And if you have any questions now, if there is any example that you would like to illustrate, I would be super happy to hear you now. Thank you.
Okay.
I have reactivated my camera in case now it works better.
Me too. Maybe you can just turn off the presentation.
Yeah, of
you
course.
need it after for the questions. We will replace it again.
Okay, fine.
So just someone has just uploaded some photos in the chat. So please, Dobrokna, would you say something?
Yes. So like in the response to the question about the examples, this is like the first thing that really came to my mind when you were talking about the architecture that really responds to the landscape and that has a cause of existence, of its existence. Sorry. So basically, this is Dorte Mandrup's entry for the competition, which was held at the end of last year in Norway. The aim of the competition was to raise awareness about whale commercial hunting, which still occurs in Norway, as it's one of 3 countries where it's still present, and also to raise the awareness of the marine life. So this project is located in the Arctic Circle, and I think it responds very well to its landscape, as it basically looks like the whale. And it looks different from 2 sides. So like from the side of the actual water, we can see that it looks like the tail of the whale. And from the land, it kind of looks as like the thing that a whale would do, like the kind of that air goes up. And I think it also really nicely fits in that area. It also is very respective, as it gives back the surface that it took from the area itself. So basically inside there's like this huge observatorium for whales. It also has some exhibitions about them, some cafes, some shops, and yeah.
Thank you. Okay, if Elisa want to reply something, or sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I forgot to reactivate. I just wanted to say that thank you, and it is a wonderful example, and I agree with you. This is a site-responsive building, but it is also a building that has the site as its reason of existence because of the observatorium that, if I understand correctly, performs a function that is relevant for the preservation of this specific kind of marine life of whales. So yeah, this is the kind of things that I would call site-specific architecture. Yeah.
Okay, then we have Ciao.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for the lecture. And I just want to say something. I feel I'm more interested about the last part, the last 5 minutes. You are talking about visual art, and then the architecture. To be honest, and it's very because I have feelings that the architecture is not about imitation visually, because architecture is not a visual art, in my opinion. And as you have already pointed out, and the Peter Esselman's examples in Portugal, where he used to be part of Spain, it's a city of the Santiago is a very famous religious city, but Peter Esselman has nothing to do with this history, and he also and he also didn't respect any of the building traditions. So I think, in my opinion, architecture respond to the sites not only by imitating the environment, but also to respect to the cultural tradition, the building traditions, and in a more subtle way, because architecture is something that lasts and for a long time, and people don't just look at it for 1 second and say, hey, this is a mountain and this is a old church, but they living in the architecture, they're living in it, and they experience it, and through times you contemplate and you think about the tradition. So maybe, I don't know why, if it's because today we don't see architecture in this way. Today we see architecture through internet, through pictures, through all these mediums, and we see 1 second, hey, this is the shape of whale, this is the shape of a mountain, but we used to don't do that historically, and usually it's just these recent decades that we begin to consume architecture faster and faster. And also, architecture is about materiality. We see the beautiful example by Triple. He used the marbles, and also how he used a brick that is similar but different from the existing context. So, and this is something architects really care about. And I don't know if I made my point, but this is my opinion, and thank you.
So, I think you made the point. Yeah.
Okay, just a little consideration that maybe is in line with this question. I was thinking about when you said that architecture is about the sites, according to which aspect, in the sense. So could be responsive and about the site according to the shape, according to maybe the material that the architects choose for building, and then also maybe for an abstract, let's say, aspect of the site, like a special need or a cultural task, for instance. So it could be also interesting to divide and explore all the shades of what is this about the sites could mean. And also just a question, just a consideration about what Ciao had said. The question of here is very important also, as you said, the representation of architecture that we have, the capacity of an image to communicate an image. And I am agree, it is very dependent on our age, our in the civilization of the image that we are inhabiting right now. So just this consideration. So Elisa, it's on you.
Okay, so first of all, thanks for the question. It is very interesting, and it is also a question that I was hoping to get, because if I could have talked 3 hours, or I have already talked too much, but if I could have talked even more, I would have definitely also touched upon this topic. Why didn't I choose to also consider the site in what I would call a broader sense? Well, for the sake of clarity, because I believe we should proceed step by step. So, when you said, you know, in a site, there are also building traditions, often, and in the specific site of the city of Santiago de Compostela, there are very, very important, very well-known religious traditions, the pilgrimage, and so on. Well, you said something that is absolutely true, but has to do with the site in a more abstract sense, like a place that is distinguished by certain cultures that revolve around it, so to speak. The culture of building buildings in a certain way, the culture of practicing religion in a certain way, okay? And what I have sought to do today is to show the kind of relationships with the site understood merely in its material sense, like the context of a building. Why do I want to do that? Well, the first point has to do with the first part of the presentation, because if we look at buildings and we draw the kind of conclusions that Bacchini draws, that their material context is an essential part of their identity, well, this is not equivalent to claiming that the material context really matters to the buildings. Because as I have claimed, in order for the material context to matter for the building has to show a certain attitude towards the material context, okay? So the first thing I wanted to do was to distinguish the idea of site specificity from this more general idea of the material context being essential to the identity of a building. And then there is a second part of the work that I have not done, which is the part where one should examine what should count as the material context of a building. And I think that, for instance, in the between the two aspects that you mentioned, there is a difference. So you mentioned building traditions and you mentioned religion. And I would say that building traditions, they are an aspect of the material site, because they reflect into how the material site looks. Whereas it is less obvious, although, of course, in some cases, certain stories can be traced, but it is not automatic, that the religious tradition of a site reflect into the shape of the material site, okay? So, one worry that I have as a philosopher is that if we use site, and this is done a lot in art theoretical literature, is done a lot, and I have read less about site-specific architecture. Also, I think there is less that has been written, but I have the feeling that more or less the same happens. So if we use site in order to talk about any contextual aspect, any cultural aspect, well, of course, we are going to be able to make a lot of points about the relationships between a building and its context. But it's going to be all very confused, okay? What I want to claim is that it is one thing to establish a relationship with the physical site, because you can develop on aspects that are evident because they can be perceived, okay? And it is another thing to establish relationships that have to do with aspects of a culture, aspects of a place, aspects of a way of being. And I'm not in any way claiming that those relationships are not important. Perhaps they're even more important than the relationships with the physical site in certain cases. But I wouldn't go around talking about site-specific architecture in that case, because this doesn't help us better understand the kind of things that can be done with the building. That is my only point, okay?
Okay.
So I think that requires another, a more complex taxonomical work that investigates relationships that are not just to physical sites, and which are super important, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And then we have at least other two questions. Sophia, please.
Hello, good day. Oh, thank you very much for the lecture. It was very, very interesting. And I think I might have like a slightly stupid question, but it is related to the site unresponsive architecture. I would like to drop some images in the chat. So if you can see in the chat, there is a picture of one of the very essential places in Moscow, in Russia. It's a square in the center of the city. It's like next to the Kremlin. And
I can't see it.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe it's still
uploading.
Yeah, but basically the point is that it used to be a very important place, a square where troops used to gather. And in the 90s, in the dark, weird period of time when the Soviet Union was taken down, and basically Moscow was this like very strange place between different powers. The mayor, city mayor Lushkov, has built like a number of atrocious projects, and this is one of those which like raises the most questions. So basically it used to be a square, and nowadays it's there is a huge underground shopping center basically underneath it. And the whole square is just essentially a skylight. And there was a theory that it was built mainly to prevent like major riots on the square, to take away the character of the square that was previously there. And it came to my mind like as soon as you mentioned site unresponsive buildings. So basically the question would be, is there any difference between site unresponsive architecture and just straight up terrible architecture, I would say? Like, can we claim that every unresponsive building, like not antagonizing, but unresponsive building, that it is like a bad architectural solution?
Okay, so I'm not sure I have an answer that, you know, I would swear upon. But what I would like to limit myself to say is this. Whenever a work of architecture or a work of art raise an ethical issue, this issue is has to be balanced towards other issues that might have to do more with the aesthetics or the functionality in the case of architecture. So I think that when we have to assess the value of a building, for instance, often what we are required to do is to achieve a sort of balance of reasons. So is the fact that this is ethically so bad, okay? That it is a building that displays, we could say, an aggressive attitude towards the citizens of the city, right? Because perhaps it was even planned to prevent riots and the expression of freedom of speech and blah, 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 blah. Well, is that fact like the only thing that emerges, that sticks out about this building? Or are there also other factors that perhaps are merits rather than demerits of it? So I will not pronounce myself about this specific building because this specific project, sorry, because I don't know it. But for instance, in the case of Warsaw's Palace of Culture and Science, the example that I gave in the presentation. Well, there I tried to stress that, well, of course it was pretty terrible, especially in the 1950s, to see this huge skyscraper being built above the ruins of what was once Warsaw. But what they built was a quite compelling building from an aesthetic viewpoint, for example. And it is a building that is still pretty functional. It hosts all sorts of restaurants and exhibition spaces and office spaces. It has a very beautiful terrace on the top. Okay, so those are also things that we should take into consideration. So what I want to claim is that the fact that a building is not site responsive does not turn it automatically into a bad building altogether. Although perhaps we could claim that not responding to the site is always an ethical flaw. That being disrespectful to the site in the way that non-site responsive architecture is from a moral viewpoint always something that we should condemn. That perhaps is true, but it is not all there is about evaluating architecture.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And we have a last question by Mimosa. Please be concise, because I don't know if the recording could go over and over.
Okay, hello. I will try to go straight to the point.
Yeah.
Then, I will go back in the beginning with the Notre Dame in Paris. If we take that and we send it somewhere else, it wouldn't seem that it belonged there. But this is a building for which we have a lot of information and for which we are used to see it in that place. But what if a building that it's still a project, would it be still considered responsive to the site if it fits in the other places too? This could also maybe link with buildings that are brands of something and they are built in the capital city of different places. So do they need to take something from the site or just the original view that they have for themselves? I hope I was concise enough to thank you.
You were concise and very clear. Okay. And again, thank you.
Thank you.
Very good question. I think that the case you have described is analogous to the case of the barn that I illustrated in my presentation. So the idea is that there might be buildings that are designed to fit in contexts, in material contexts, that are not particular, that are generic. And it's easier, perhaps, to think of a generic context if we take into consideration a generic landscape, as I did. But generic contexts probably can also be some city contexts, especially in the contemporary world where we have some city environments that basically look one the replica of another. But one thing that I want to stress is that being a particular context and being a generic context is not a matter of black and white, of yes and not. It's a spectrum, okay? So again, if you have to assess whether a building is specific to a particular site or not, okay, you will have to gather as much information as possible about the site. It might even be that even, contemporary city centers that look very much the same turn up to have developed across time their own specific story that reflects in the building and makes them particular buildings, okay? So as you said yourself, it is also a matter of the kind of information that we can gather upon the sites. Thanks. I hope this has answered your question.
So the very last question is by Miguel. Yes, please.
It's not really a question, but I wanted to share something regarding when you were mentioning how you, if you move a building from one place to another, will it be the same? And we have an example here in the Philippines where it's very hard to keep heritage and historic structures alive. And there was one developer that basically bought historic houses and moved them to another part in the Philippines and made an amusement park, or sort of those historic buildings. And I went there before my architecture education, but it was very compelling that the feeling that it was misplaced already was there. There was some, materiality, it was completely the same, if not more restored in a way, but by moving it from its original site, a lot of the essence was lost, in my opinion. I'll post the pictures in the site, in the group, but yes, so if ever, it's an example, it's called Acuzar de Las Casas Filipinas de Acuzar, and they basically moved around 50 houses from all over the Philippines to one site, and basically made a Disneyland for historic buildings, and it's very weird. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
That's a wonderful illustration, a real-life illustration of the case of moving Notre Dame to Las Vegas. So I'm immensely thankful for the suggestion, and I will look into it more thoroughly. And I just wanted to say one more thing about what I see in the comments. So there is a picture of the Moscow State University building, and you are pointing out that it looks like the Warsaw building, and that similar buildings have also been built in Riga, Bucharest, and Prague. Yeah, I don't remember if I mentioned it when I was describing the building, but that was part of the point. So instead of taking into consideration its site, the Warsaw site, the Palace of Culture and Science is about other sites, okay? So it is not responsive to its site, but the fact that it is not responsive to its site does not prevent it from being about other sites. It's a bit like the pyramids outside of the Louvre that are about the Cairo pyramids in Giza. And of course, this has all sorts of disturbing ethical undertones. But thanks, you are responding wonderfully. I'm very, very happy as a teacher.
Okay, thank you so much. Just I have a lot of consideration, but I can't do it right. I can't do them right now. Just a general question that all these lecture was about is about the relationship, of course, between the nature with the capital and with architecture as, let's say, a madman nature in a sense. So I appreciate a lot also Elisa, because also she has a methodology that is different from mine. So it's an opportunity for all of you to listen to a different methodology to do philosophy. And also I have a lot of notes as usual, many papers. I would say something about Bosco Verticale, but it's a very long story, so I can do it right now. The last suggestion I want to mention is one architecture by Toyo Ito, that you, of course, know. And this architecture is the Shimazu Municipal Museum, no? And I don't know, maybe it could consider, maybe you can go and investigate it, a site-specific architecture, due to the fact that the structure is in a very dialogue with water. The shape of the main building, it's similar to a ship that is turned upside down, and also a very important fact that the second volume of the building is built into the mountain. And finally, also the floor is warmed by the thermal water of the source near there. So it's very complex, the intertwining between this architecture and nature, but is one of the 1,000 examples you can reflect about. So I would say again, thank you to Elisa. Thank you very much for this inspiring lecture. And thank you for sharing us your research and your thoughts about this topic with us, and also with all the public of Mantova Architettura. And thank you again for your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I had a blast, and it was great to interact with all of you. Bye-bye.